Good morning, everyone. We will begin shortly in about 5 minutes. So, thank you for your patience. All right, let's begin. Thank you everyone for joining us today on our very first technical webinar of the year. A happy new year to everyone who's made it. Um, and today our technical webinar is focusing on the preservation of modern architecture in the UAE, which is being delivered by one of our corporate members, Grfn. So, just before we begin, I'd like to just make a few general introductions. So, my name is Jason John, and I work as the technical engineer for the Emirates Green Building Council. In case you're joining us for the first time, just an introduction about us, the Emirates Green Building Council. We were established in 2006 with the goal of advancing green building principles. Our vision is for the UAE to be a global leader for sustainability, and we achieve this through our mission by acting as a hub for collaboration and a hub for excellence to promote sustainability of the built environment. A bit of housekeeping for the webinar. So the webinar itself is an interactive webinar in the sense that we will be holding questions. You're free to ask questions either at any point during the webinar, and we'll address them towards the end of the presentation. But for the purposes of organizing this webinar, as soon as you enter, your microphones are muted and they will stay muted throughout the entire webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them on the chat box on the right-hand side of your control panel. Our technical team here at the Emirates Green Building Council, we are monitoring the questions as they come in, and we will ask them towards the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions that come up, please type them down and we will address them at a later point within this webinar. After the webinar, we will be sharing the recording of the presentation to all the attendees and the registrants. I would also like to ask you to complete the survey once the webinar is complete. And lastly, follow us on social media either on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook at EmiratesGBC to keep up to date on our regular events as we start off this new year. So, to introduce our facilitator from Grfn today, I would like to introduce Aya Halawani, Head of Design and Partner at Grfn. Aya is an architect and interior designer with a Bachelor's of Architecture from the American University in Sharjah. Her experience is in residential and commercial spatial design and refurbishment with a grasp on sustainability features and passive design techniques in architectural designs. Driven by the belief that the approach to building sustainable environments is a holistic one, her work attempts to marry sustainability, function, and aesthetic. With a background in both architecture and urban planning, she is able to work across scales, seamlessly navigating between community scale design, architecture, and interior design. Aya is continuing her education in sustainability and adaptation in the built environment. So thank you so much for joining us today, Aya. I will be handing over controls to you in a minute, and you should be able to share your screen from that. So Aya, the floor is yours. You are the presenter now.
Thank you, Jason. Hello, everyone. Let me know when you can see my screen.
Yes, absolutely. I can see it.
All right, perfect. All right, so hi, I'm Aya, and I'll be talking today about preservation of modern architecture, and the angle we'll be taking is looking at it from the heritage perspective and from the climate emergency perspective. So we'll be talking about heritage, value, and identity, and then we'll be moving on to an overview of modernist architecture in the UAE. Then I'll discuss a bit about the importance of retrofitting this specific building stock and the issues that arise from when we attempt the retrofits and some solutions and recommendations. And then I'll be moving on to a few examples of retrofitting modernist buildings, and then we discuss future-proofing design. So first, I'd like to start with a definition on heritage. These are actually a collection of definitions for the word heritage, which is a very loose word used for many aspects of our inherited culture. So a basic definition by the Cambridge Dictionary is that heritage is features belonging to the culture of a particular society, such as traditions, languages, or buildings that were created in the past and still have historical importance. Another definition, which is a bit more related to the built environment, is by the UNESCO, which indicates that cultural heritage such as monuments, groups of buildings, or sites with outstanding universal value from the viewpoint of history, art, or science. And Abu Dhabi culture defines specifically the modern heritage of Abu Dhabi as monuments, buildings, or neighborhoods that are a result of the collective experience that narrates the Emirates transformation from the 60s to the present day. This is significant because the time frame of modern architecture in the West is typically between 1925 and the 50s, sometimes until the 60s, but modern transformation in the UAE began with the discovery of oil. In the modern theory by Brandy, the qualities of cultural heritage are the historical and the aesthetic values. So how is this value deduced? And how do we determine whether buildings have the cultural significance to be classified as heritage? In broader terms, values plus objects constitutes heritage. So assigning value to some things transforms them from just objects and places into heritage by giving them significance. So these objects, buildings, and places become recognized as heritage through collective conscious decisions. And these conscious decisions and values belong to a particular people and institutions. Individuals or the society identifies the stories invested in these objects, and basically they become heritage when they represent something that is worth remembering. Heritage is also very closely linked to identity. So Susan Pierce, professor of museum studies, suggests that the notion of cultural heritage embraces any and every aspect of life that individuals in their variously scaled social groups consider explicitly or implicitly to be part of their self-definition. Another form of identity that I'd like to talk about is not the identity of people, but rather the identity of the place. So basically, this is typically called genius loci, and it's the belief that every place has its unique qualities, not only in terms of the physical makeup, but also how it's perceived. And it is to be enhanced rather than destroyed. It's the responsibility of designers and architects to basically maintain this spirit. Alexander Pope, which is an English poet, sums this up in his essay saying that all must be adapted to the genius of the place and beauty is not forced into it, but resulting from it. So this basically means that when we're looking for design intent or direction in design, we should be inspired by the context and the existing structures in the place, rather than imposing our own preconceptions on it. All right, so what is conservation? Conservation is a complex and continual process that involves determination about what constitutes heritage. So basically, how is it used or cared for, or how is it interpreted, and so on. Also, by whom and for whom. The decisions about what to conserve and how to conserve are usually defined by cultural context, societal trends, and political and economic forces. Conservation facilitates continuity in heritage and in culture. Essentially, when we decide to conserve a selection of objects from an era, it guarantees that there's no disconnect in the historical lineage. And it's important to note that the UAE tradition is not just wind towers and courtyard houses. It's really multi-layered and it is very complex. So many argue that tradition is absent in the modernist building aesthetic. I don't think that tradition is absent from this era, but you will find that it reflects the visions and aspirations of the people and the leadership back then. The modernist aesthetic was really a direct result of the multicultural demographic of the UAE, which was drawn to this region during the boom in the 60s and the 70s. Another thing is that tradition is ever changing, so it's basically it's a continuous flow, and this is a part of it. So each architectural period really has its own significance and has its own impact on the people and heritage. When we look at the architecture itself, we see that the architectural elements of these buildings really witness culture, people, and events that occurred during this lifetime. So the discovery of oil and the economical boom that came during that time is definitely something that we'd like to maintain within our historical lineage. Another point is the sheer fact that this discussion is a bit controversial. Could controversy be enough motive to conserve? All right, so back to the idea of value. The relationship between values and conservation is a circular one. Basically, values inform what objects need to be conserved, and conservation preserves those values for the future. So preservation is essentially informed by the past and it affects the future. Conservation really also shapes the society in which it is situated, and it is in turn also shaped by the needs and the dynamics of that society. The ultimate aim of conservation, however, is not to really conserve the material as much as it is to maintain the values that are embodied in these objects or these buildings. So these values are typically grouped under the term cultural significance. So what is the cultural significance of modern architecture in the UAE? All right, so let's start with an overview of modern heritage in the UAE. The early stages of modern architecture in the UAE began really in the 30s, and that was when the first airport was built in Sharjah. And this is a photo of the old airport. A few buildings were later erected in the 40s, but the 50s and the 60s is really when the modernization process sort of accelerated. And this came when expectations of oil production attracted Western companies for investment opportunities. These expectations were also enhanced by the rulers' visions towards the future, and these structures reflect that phase. All right, it's important to note that while modern in Western countries, when the idea of modernism emerged in Western communities, they emerged within secular societies. But in the Emirates, when it arrived a more conservative one. So the question was how to adapt the existing urban fabric of the closely knit streets and the vernacular style to the modern lifestyle needs. The architectural elements were also adapted as a response to the harsh weather conditions. So you'll see in the photos the modernized mashrabiyas and the overhangs and facade shading, etc. So this created a very unique architectural language, and it was facilitated by this kind of experimentation with the typologies that already existed in the UAE and the sort of the Arabized elements of mashrabiyas, etc., through a process of basically adaptation and hybridization. So it really is a true reflection of sort of the combination of these two styles. All right, so here are a few of the most iconic buildings that we have lost over time. So this is the Plaza Cinema, which was the first cinema to open its doors in the UAE. And that was in '72, a year after the union, and it was built to cater to the growing expatriate community. These photos by Ammar Al-Attar. If you access his website, you'll see a very thorough documentation of the demolition process, and it's really nostalgic. This is the Dubai Metropolitan Hotel, and it was built in '78. It's now replaced by Al Habtoor complex, which is basically 3 hotels and a few residential buildings. This is the Ramada Hotel, and it was built in '83. And as you drove by, you could see the 41-meter stained glass window, which was really quite amazing. And all right, here are a few buildings that are still here with us. So this is the Abu Dhabi main bus terminal. It was built in '83, and the style is very distinct. So it's a combination of curves and horizontal linear forms, which gives it a very specific style. This is the Bank Street complex. It was built in '77, and actually these buildings were scheduled for demolition to be replaced with another development. But in 2018, the Fikra graphic design Biennale sort of took the idea of taking over this building and hosting the Biennale inside. So what they did was essentially they kept everything intact. So the building was abandoned. So there was a lot of furniture, computers. So they left everything in place, and they displayed the artwork alongside the existing furniture and walls, etc. So this sort of delayed the demolition because of how successful the Biennale was. So it's nice to see how a certain gesture could really save a building. This is the Dubai Petroleum Building, and it is a 4-story building that was built in '78. The building also currently houses Dubai RSP and the Dubai Supreme Council of Energy. And this is a brutalist building, but it's also it has the sort of Arabized style of the Mashabiyah on its facade. So it's nice to see a combination of these 2 styles. Now, in reality, many of these buildings are smaller in size and with unidentified designers and architects. So if you take a walk in Bar Dubai or in Deira, they're really everywhere, and they're a lot more than what we can list here. And they're basically what old Dubai is. All right, so we'll be moving on to another viewpoint on modern architecture, which is how they respond to the climate emergency. And I'll start by going through why it is important to be retrofitting this building stock. So previously, buildings did not have to adhere to any insulation requirements. In Dubai, for example, this was issued by Decree 66 in 2003 only. So basically these buildings are typically not insulated, so they would need a lot more in terms of retrofit. The existing building stock prior to the implementation of any energy building code this is the largest stock. And the UAE Vision 2021, the Green Economy Strategy for Sustainable Development, Dubai Plans 2030 and 2050, and the Abu Dhabi Plan 2030 are the most prominent strategies that aim to strengthen sustainable built environments in the country. And these could not possibly be achieved without addressing the inefficiencies in the existing building stock. Conservation and preservation of heritage. So this is related to value and it's basically historical lineage. Another point is that most of the buildings that will exist in 2050 will have already been built. So this building stock will probably still exist in 2050. This is an important point, which is looking beyond operational energy consumption alone and accounting for embodied carbon. So we really need to be focusing largely on carbon production associated with the manufacturing transport and installation of the construction materials that is associated with these buildings. So preserving these buildings conserves the enormous amount of material resources that are invested in them, and basically avoids the consumption of even more resources. All right, so next I'm going to be discussing a few challenges that face the industry as they approach retrofitting these buildings. First, we need to establish that conservation is different than retrofit in the way that it entails maintaining the aesthetics of the building, which could prove difficult if the intent is to reduce energy consumption. For example, if the building envelope is vulnerable, then swapping it for something more efficient might change the overall look of the building. So the question becomes, do we preserve for continuity of heritage or to maximize operational performance while compromising aesthetics? I believe that a balance between sensitivity in design and achieving operational targets can really be achieved through adopting a more multidisciplinary approach. And this means involving experts in the arts, engineering, architecture, and perhaps even from the civil society to work together on conservation projects. When conserving or retrofitting, we must also take into consideration the current and the future technological standards and expectations, as well as user comfort issues and the environmental performance. On the right here, this is a prime example of a restoration that did not take into consideration the aesthetics of the original building. So this is the Nata building before and after facelift. The facade of the old building is arguably better for the performance of the building than the glass cladding. The facelift essentially compromised shading to add glass. So we couldn't obtain details on the glass specs, but what we know for a fact is that it radically increased the window to wall ratio, which is against recommendation for the UAE climate, unless of course the glass is of superior specs. Next, we look at the experimental forms and techniques used by these buildings, which is a characteristic of modern buildings in general. So we see thin forms and fragile materials, such as the ones on the photo on the right, the ENBT building. System preservation rather than unit preservation. So this is related more to the study of studying preservation. So when we look at preservation of historical buildings, we're looking at maintaining bricks, for example, and so if there's a brick or a unit that is deteriorated, we can basically swap it out or preserve it in that way. But when we look at modernist buildings, we're looking more at systems. So cladding systems, roof systems, mechanical systems, and the preservation industry, the preservation sort of academia needs to be, this needs to be integrated within preservation academia, basically. Another issue is that it's difficult to find materials that match the originals and that preserve the design intent, which basically could sometimes mean that we need to change an entire floor or wall finish, for example, to achieve a more harmonious look. And this doesn't really serve the design intent. These buildings also don't typically age gracefully, so it feels like we may be attempting to maintain buildings that basically inherently have a short lifespan. So is it a futile exercise? Are they really ever going to be resilient enough? And then the issue of vulnerability to air and water infiltration. These set of points are related to the building design itself. So is the building flexible in its design? Does it allow for adaptive reuse? Does it, for example, have an open space plan, adequate daylighting? Or is the building rigid in design with smaller compartmentalized spaces and darker rooms, etc.? The opportunity of replacing deteriorated architectural systems without compromising the whole. This could be related to mechanical systems as well, or building envelopes, for example. Availability of documentation and identification of author and architect. So missing documentation can sometimes mean surprises when the retrofit is actually attempted. So here this is a list of a few of the technical issues that are faced when retrofitting these buildings. So indoor environmental quality, which is an issue typical of older buildings. It is typically not feasible to retrofit older AC systems with more efficient chilled water systems. Facade and insulation retrofits are typically too expensive to undertake. Electrical systems and infrastructures such as cables, panels, etc. Their upgrades and replacements are also too expensive and invasive. Sometimes these buildings need to be completely shut down because the building systems will need to be ripped apart and redone. Other issues that arise are that sometimes heritage is seen as irrelevant to the current environmental, economic, and political crises. So basically issues of climate emergency, poverty, conflict, displacement. Is the preservation of heritage in its entirety an outdated concept? There's also a mainstream concept of the throwaway city, which is removing the old to make room for the new. This is a photo of the Metropolitan Hotel being demolished. Yeah, the one that was presented earlier and was replaced by the hotel complex. Their preservation is not economically viable for all the reasons mentioned previously, and the lack of collaboration between technical and social sciences experts. We essentially need to be putting experts in arts and preservation with technical experts in the same room as we tackle these buildings. Another issue is the lack of the public involvement, which basically if we involve the public in the issues of preservation, this would promote value definition and the cultural significance of these buildings. It would also establish the public as stakeholders in these buildings. Modernist buildings are typically energy guzzlers. So in older buildings, it's more common for the installed AC systems to be of DX or split or window ACs. These systems are less efficient than chilled water-based systems or chillers, basically. But let's consider this scenario. So an office building that is served by chillers, and it's after working hours. And basically there's only one person in this office. We will need to operate a full chiller to serve that one person. The design at part load and the control system become very crucial in such a case. While if that building was served by a DX system, for example, it would be easy to turn off all machines except the one serving that single office. So controls are still crucial anyway to make sure other machines are off, but it's definitely easier to cater for part loads in that scenario. We previously did energy audits for a portfolio of buildings owned by one of the governmental entities in Dubai. They were all office buildings. So the older ones with DX units had lower energy utilization indices, and the newer ones with better insulation and chiller systems had higher EUIs. So this is basically a real-life reflectance of the previously explained scenario. In an in-depth market study that we conducted within a consortium for the Dubai RSP, we studied the cooling market in terms of market shares and system efficiencies. So the results of these studies are also published on RSP's website. What we can see here is on the top pie chart is that 50% of the installed AC in Dubai is of the less efficient types. The bottom chart confirms that cooling is needed. So the bottom chart, if we look at it, it confirms that cooling is indeed the largest consumer of energy in buildings. It constitutes 67% at peak. So this highlights basically the significance of retrofitting cooling systems for improved efficiency, and it's highlighted in today's topic. And in continuation of the same study, we conducted in situ measurements of cooling systems efficiency segregated by age. Here we see how the efficiency of the AC technologies decreases over time. Basically, the older the building or the system, the more energy it's going to consume. All right, so we'll be moving to a few suggestions and recommendations on approaching the retrofit and preservation of modernist buildings. Firstly, we need to establish a definition of heritage in the UAE that is inclusive of the modernist era. Another aspect is linking value with modernist buildings. So what we see is that the greater part of the conservation research still focuses on the challenges of the physical conditions of the building, but it might prove useful to concentrate on the actual context of these buildings rather than just the objects. When we try to link heritage value to these buildings, then maybe the retrofits will become more viable, basically overlooking the costs of undertaking these retrofits. Another thing is that when we as a society decide to conserve something, it's mostly because of its authenticity or the intrinsic value, or because this object is a masterpiece. But maybe what we need to do is to actually quantify this sort of value and create the processes that systematically classify these buildings as conservation worthy. Another thing is the realization that maybe not all of these buildings can be saved, but most of them can. So I think it makes the task of retrofitting these buildings a little bit easier. So it's a little bit of a less fundamentalist approach to the issue. It's not basically a take it or leave it. So it's more of a case by case. All right, so next is the preservation of modernist buildings is different than preservation of historical buildings. So this was a discussion between the point discussed earlier about preservation of the units or the bricks or the units that make up the historical buildings versus the systems that make up modernist buildings. The last point is about pairing the arts and heritage discourse around modernist buildings with technical expertise. Again, the issue of the fact that both of these discourses are working separately, and having everyone in one room discussing these could help the cause. The next point is about recognizing the importance of retrofitting modern buildings in achieving Paris Accord targets and shifting the focus from new builds. Again, this is the largest building stock, and if we are going to achieve the Paris Accord targets, we need to be looking at them. The next point is about reframing preservation intents to serve societal and economic gains. So preservation can essentially take different forms, and it can have different intents. So it could be cultural. For example, we have an old school, and we enhance the school to serve societal needs, or economical. So basically turning it into a money-generating enterprise for economic gain. So turning it into a hotel or a cafe or a library. But I don't think that any of these two options is better than the other. I think it really depends on the stakeholders and the values of the society. So but we need to keep in mind that these decisions that we take now will also will be very, they will influence how this building is viewed in the future. The development of codes that regulate the conservation and retrofit of modernist buildings. I think a lot of times it's difficult for us to bring the performance of these buildings up to the standard of that's expected of new builds. But if we have a separate set of codes and regulations that regulates this process, then it could be helpful. Seeking incremental improvement in mechanical system inefficiencies is better than no improvement. Again, a less fundamentalist approach to retrofits. Research and development needed for ways to approach maintenance and enhancement of building performance from that era. All right, so next I'd like to talk about the concept of co-creation and basically bringing experts together and stakeholders together. So conservation is not objective. It's biased by the values and perspectives of various individuals and interest groups. So when we identify stakeholders and we involve them early in the process, it typically alleviates a lot of the conflicts that arise during design and ensures a smoother process. So mapping the stakeholders in a way that's exhaustive ensures a smoother implementation process. So conservation is really a combination of academic inquiry, research, policy making, planning, and technical expertise, and also user insight, which would be extremely beneficial in determining the fate of these buildings. So the idea of co-creation essentially takes collaboration a step further. So this is a diagram showcasing the different levels of involvement and their turnout. So if you have stakeholders in a building and one stakeholder only informs the other of changes, etc., this is usually faced with rejection. But as you move up that ladder into consulting, involvement, collaborating, and co-creation, people start to have ownership over the project, and it generally goes smoother. So a great example of public involvement is the initiative led by Dubai municipality, where as a citizen or resident, you could nominate the buildings that need preservation. This insight can make preservation more relative to the societies in which they are a part of. And it generally increases the enthusiasm around conservation. Here I'll be listing a few of the current efforts in preservation. So the Modern Heritage Initiative by Dubai municipality to protect buildings from the 60s and 70s that are considered part of the memory of the place and contributing to the story of the development of Dubai. The initiative already had a few buildings listed, but as I said, these buildings can be nominated as well. Abu Dhabi culture includes modern architectural heritage within conservation efforts, and it identifies it as a result of the collective experience that narrates the Emirates transformation from the 60s to the present day. And the efforts of Sheikh Sultan Saud Al-Qasimi, who actively sheds the light on the importance of preservation of modern architecture in Sharjah and the UAE. All right, so next I'll be showcasing a few cases of retrofit of modernist buildings. This is actually in, not here, it's in New York, but the JP Morgan Chase Tower, it was built in between 57 and 60. And the reason I chose this as a great example because the building underwent one of the largest renovations in history, and it achieved LEED Platinum status. Sadly, the building could not be saved because the demolition of the building actually started in 2019 to be replaced by a taller tower. And the reason for that was that they needed to accommodate 15,000 occupants instead of the previous 6,000. This is the recently opened Flying Saucer in Sharjah. It was initially opened in '78, and it really served many purposes over the years. It was previously occupied by a co-op, as you can see in the image. It was later acquired by the Sharjah Arts Foundation, and it underwent a 3-year renovation process and finally opened to the public this year. And it is a arts and community space. The process of renovation, as cited by Mona Al-Musfi, which is the architect on the project and who was also my professor during my university years. The process basically comprised of removing the annex that was attached to the building. So there was an extension to the building that was removed. And there was also a lot of cladding and additional pillars, which obstructed the 360 views within the space. So this, you can see how it was transformed in the photos. Next is Alfaya Retreat. Alfaya Retreat was originally 2 single-story buildings, and they were built in the 60s. They were previously occupied by a clinic and a grocery store. So it was redesigned by an architect, and the architects chose to actually maintain the to juxtapose the materials of the old stone buildings with steel to emphasize the distinction between the old and the new. So they kept the original stone and they added steel. So the spaces were also extended to allow for the programs to take place, which now basically it houses 5 bedrooms, a restaurant, and a spa, and a dining and a living room. Next, I want to discuss a few concepts that basically would help alleviate the problems that we're facing with retrofitting modern architecture today. So the two concepts, the first one is design for repurposing, which is basically as we design new structures today, we keep in mind that the way these spaces are going to be used could be changed in the future. So taking into consideration flexible space design and easily replaceable systems. One great example of this is the UAE Expo, in which plans of repurposing are underway. So I mean, as they're building the structure, they're already thinking about how the space is going to be used in the future. So Grfn is actually working on the UAE Pavilion, and the plans for it are to be turned into an exhibition space. The next concept is design for deconstruction, which is essentially you design with the intent that the parts can be disassembled without compromising the material integrity of the whole. So it enables reuse and recycling. One great way of approaching this is the concept of prefabrication. So because as you assemble them, most of these elements can be disassembled in the same way that they are assembled. And I'll leave you with a few of modernist buildings that are worthy of preservation. And yeah, this is my email address and my LinkedIn account. I'd be happy to connect with anyone post the webinar. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Aya, for that wonderful and lovely presentation. I believe I'm not the only one who can say that I was quite nostalgic looking at some of the old pictures that you're seeing on some of the buildings throughout the presentation. So yeah, it's really great to see. So on that note, though, I want to ask you a question based on, so you mentioned that Dubai municipality has an initiative where you can nominate a building for preservation, but then what is the process of, like, how do they judge, or how do they select the building that should be preserved?
I'm going to be honest with you. This was, I mean, the idea of nominating the building was announced during the press release. But when I myself attempted to sort of do that, I mean, I didn't go through with the entire process, but it was a bit confusing on how to approach it.
Okay.
But in terms of the actual buildings, I think the time frame in which the building is constructed and whether it has any architectural merits should be able to classify the building for preservation.
Okay. So it's not only looking at the age of the building per se, but also looking at it from a architectural perspective as well, to making sure that some ideology or some sort of heritage or culture is represented within those buildings, right?
Yes, essentially.
Okay. So you've pointed out, so Dubai municipality is looking at basically buildings from the 50s to 60s, right? And Abu Dhabi is looking at buildings after the 60s. What about the other Emirates like Ras Al Khaimah, Ajman? these Emirates also have like considerably quite old buildings as well. So is there any sort of movement from those other Emirates as well?
Uh, I'm personally not aware of any sort of movements happening there, but again, when the boom happened during that time frame, Dubai and Abu Dhabi were sort of the leading Emirates in that sense. Uh, so yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there are any movements from Northern Emirates as well to preserve their modern architectural heritage.
Yeah, definitely. Because in Sharjah, I grew up in Sharjah, so yeah, seeing the flying saucer roundabout. It used to be a roundabout once upon a time, and seeing that how it's transitioned into the public space today, it actually is really lovely to see that because there was a period in time where it was uncertain whether or not they would keep the flying saucer when they were demolishing the roundabout that was there.
Yeah, yeah. So Sharjah actually has. I feel like Sharjah has a very cultural edge, and their preservation efforts are very visible. So there's also Sheikh Sultan Saud Al Qasimi who really advocates for the preservation of these buildings in Sharjah. So it was nice to see the transformation on my experience
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and even the Bank Street that you showed the picture of, that's in Sharjah as well, in the like the heart of Rola. So over there, like they even have like the fort over there, and they have a few like really historical buildings, kind of like the Al Fahidi district, but a bit
there.
smaller. So yeah, definitely I agree.
Yeah.
Sharjah is great in that sense.
Yeah, it is, and I'm really looking forward to more people embracing this and really stepping towards preserving food across the Emirates.
Great. So I have a question that has come in. So one of the questions is, um, how do we move or how do we transition the government and the private construction sector, basically the built the industry to be motivated towards preservation of these buildings, because at the end of the day, I suppose, yeah, these buildings sort of have a nostalgic feel about it, like people connect with it. It's very individualistic, according to, like, let's say someone who's born here, someone who's been here for 5 years or 10 years. And given that the UAE sort of is a transient place, a lot of people who who come to the UAE also end up leaving at some point or the other. How do you motivate people basically to care about this?
I think this goes back to sort of the idea of that preservation could have societal value and economic value. So the government could be looking at this in a way of sort of enhancing the community, but the private sector could be looking at this in a way where this could be a sort of a money generating enterprise. Um, I know a lot of people think, I mean, a lot of people would think that, or would argue that that basically creating money generating enterprises out of these cultural spaces might not be right. But I mean, I've seen a few times when it's worked, and you end up showcasing how beautiful these buildings are. The next is the idea of co-creation. So once you involve all the stakeholders, so the government, the building users, the historians, architects, so that sort of generates a discussion around these buildings, and I think it creates that cultural significance to and motive to preserve.
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's basically of identifying those win-win scenarios for the stakeholders where it's you're promoting not only the culture of the thing, but you're also showing the economic benefits. I think is probably
Yeah.
the best way to go about it. Definitely.
Mhm.
Um, Another question that we have, this is okay, so yeah, this is quite interesting. So basically in terms of architecture and seeing how, well, there's basically old Dubai and new Dubai. How there's a sudden like shift, or you can see the shift between, like, let's say Dera and Bur Dubai, and you're going towards downtown. There's like it's a completely different shift in aesthetics. So how do you sort of like get around that sort of issue, like from a urban planning sort of perspective as well? Like, how do you like sort of meld those two together?
Um, I don't think you necessarily need to melt them. I mean, each one of them has its own characteristics. This one was built at a specific era, and this was built at a specific. Maybe this juxtaposition is not a very bad thing. It's good to see each let's say architectural time reflected in the architecture. And in terms of urban planning, I mean, there's a lot that could be done in terms of linking them in terms of streets, etc. But if you're, I mean, I'm not really understanding the idea of the question when it comes to sort of melding them.
I think it basically from like a visual aesthetic sort of sense, as in like the juxtaposition, as you mentioned, like of going from one era to another area is just so stark in contrast. Uh,
Yeah,
that
this is
yeah.
this is a characteristic of Dubai. I mean, you wouldn't want to take that away. Sometimes you'd be standing in Satwan and looking on Sheikh Zayed Road, and you really see that that juxtaposition of these sort of older buildings in the forefront, and then Sheikh Zayed Road in the back. And this is a characteristic of the Dubai skyline, I guess. I mean, I don't
Yeah,
know
I
if it
think
is.
yeah, definitely. I think that's a very good way to look at things as well. There's beauty in contrast as well, in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Another question also, this is also so looking at international examples for preservation of like old or historical buildings in other countries, for example, Europe, Asia, Americas, and so on. Is there something that we can learn from the preservation of those historical buildings, given that they were built like probably in the 17th and 18th century in terms of both preservation and energy conservation, energy and water conservation?
Yes, so and I mean, of course, like a lot of I mean, the European countries typically have really much older buildings. So we ourselves, we worked on a 200-year-old building in London, and it was a residential building, and it was really quite interesting to see how the exterior of the building is, and then it houses a sort of a modern lifestyle. So this is in terms of sort of the design. Also, um, London I mean, the UK, while here in the UAE, most of the buildings in 2050 will be built today. In the UK, 80% of their building stock will still exist, will still be in use by 2050. So the idea of sort of reuse of these buildings is not new, and it adds a very specific feel to European cities as well. In terms of energy and water, there's a lot to be learned on that from Europe. So because of the sheer size of their of the building stock that they have, and sort of the less land available for new construction, this is essentially what they do, right? So there's definitely a lot to learn as we look there.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely great. And I think, yeah, Europe is a key thing to remember is the fact that they have limited land in the first place. So for them, it's really about making sure that their built environment or the existing stock is basically caught up in terms of in terms of regulations and policies of the building materials and so on. Because I think the EU in general has a directive for renovating like old buildings as well, so that they're basically energy efficient.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, they have very strict targets in terms of their in reaction to the sort of the climate emergency. So whether it's net zero Britain, Paris Accord. So they have a lot of sort of regulation to encourage that kind of retrofit.
So is this something that you think could benefit the UAE in general, is having those sort of that clear pathway of retrofitting X number of building stock, or like buildings that are built after a certain time period? It's so that not only are these buildings being conserved and preserved, but like you're also retrofitting them at the same time.
Yes, definitely. I think this kind of building stock is a little bit neglected, in the sense that even when buildings here are being requested to be retrofitted, they're not these very old buildings, right? So they're actually sort of the newer ones. So having some sort of regulation that regulates retrofitting these buildings from that era, and maybe I mean, maybe these codes are actually more lenient than new builds, because sometimes it's very difficult to achieve those targets on these older buildings. But again, this is more from a less fundamental approach, where we're going for a little bit of improvement better than no improvement at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And from our latest publication in Advancing Deep Retrofit, it's basically these buildings that have the most potential in terms of energy savings and water savings, because you're basically taking them from a time period where they were built in maybe like the 70s or so, and getting them up to like the modern age. So over there, like looking at a systems approach to retrofitting, also you have the opportunity there to making savings of up to 50% as well, and that's not too uncommon, considering some of the retrofits that have been done already in the UAE kind of already close to that mark of 50% energy savings and water savings.
Yeah, exactly. So the potential is really, really great in preserving them, both from energy saving perspective and also from the heritage perspective. And this is where I feel there's a disconnect. So once you put this value back into these buildings, I think the retrofits become really viable.
Absolutely. So I believe that was the last of the questions, Aya. Unless anyone has any more questions, I'll just wait maybe another 20 seconds or 30 seconds or so. So feel free to ask any more questions if you have any to our facilitator, Aya. Hold on, I'm getting a question. All right, so I don't see anyone has any more questions in the meantime. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Aya, for our very first presentation of the new year. It was absolutely a fantastic one, and a very interesting one in the sense that it tackles an important question and topic that seems to be overlooked in a lot of cases, but it is nonetheless a very important one at the end of the day. So thank you so much, and thank you, Grfn, for facilitating our webinar of the first webinar of the year.
Thank you, Jason.
So for everyone else joining us, we have the 2021 calendar open for technical workshops. If you would like to facilitate a technical workshop here with us at Emirates GBC, please feel free to reach out at technical workshops at emirates.gbc.com, so to contact us. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you in our future workshop and events. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.